know almost everybody here. Richard, is it? Hi, Richard.
Hi.
And then, what's your name?
I'm Kelly.
Kelly. So, today I'm going to be talking about how I think about meditation. And I was reflecting on this recently. We just finished a retreat with Shinzen Young. He was at the monastery, and it was very significant for me because, I've been practicing now for about 12 years, and in the first year or two of my kind of practicing life, I got introduced to Shinzen's Science of Enlightenment audio series. It was 20 hours long of just Shinzen geeking out about how amazing it is that meditation and science are coming together. And it just really captured my imagination and really propelled me along this path of practice that I've been on now, for 12 years. I've lived at the monastery for 3 years and lived at a Goenka Center for 1.5 years, which, if you don't know, is a very kind of weird boot camp-like experience of meditation. And all along the way, I've been very obsessed with and I think it was partly having to do with the same inquiry that Shinzen was on. I was like, what exactly are we doing when we sit down and are just quiet, and we turn in, so to speak, and do something, follow our breath, pay attention to our sensations? How can we kind of make sense of what it is that we're doing such that we have confidence and creativity, and such that we can sort of allow our experience and our insights to grow in accordance with an understanding, a conceptual understanding of what it is that we're doing when we sit. Now, most of the kind of approaches you find will say something like, if you do this meditation, then you will experience these benefits. But there's a missing piece there, right? Why is it that you will experience these benefits, right? So if I drop an apple from my hand, it will fall to the ground. But what is missing there is the theory of gravity, right? So there's some kind of explanatory power that we can access, I believe, that helps us make sense of what it is that we're doing when we spend 100 hours on the cushion just observing our experience. So I'm hoping that I can kind of unpack that for you a little bit. At least how I do that. That's not to say it's the only way. So unlike other Sunday sits, I would invite people to ask questions while I'm giving this talk, just because I don't want to lose you and then keep going and then things won't make sense. Yeah.
Can I ask you to put the mic on?
Oh, sure. Great. Thank you. So feel free to ask questions. So the basic idea, kind of where this whole frame starts, is that the recognition that as human beings, we have this perhaps unique capacity to look at things in different ways. And my favorite example to use for this is trees, right? Now, you could look at that tree as a biological organism, and you could understand the way that it takes nutrients from the soil, uses sunlight to create energy, so on and so forth. You could understand it as a biological organism. You could also understand it as a resource, right, that you could extract, that you could take and turn into wood, that you could build a house with, or perhaps the leaves are some kind of medicine. Right? That's a different way of looking at what that tree is. You could also look at it, as some wisdom traditions do, as a spiritual friend. Right? That's another way of looking at what a tree is. All of those ways of looking are available to us as humans. And they may or may not be accessible to us, but they are available to us humans. We all have the same kind of hardware. that's capable of accessing those diversity of ways of looking and many more, right? And so for any given thing, there are many different ways of looking. So this is the core kind of thesis, the premise on which this whole framework is based. So when I say you can look at things in different ways, I mean you can sense things in different ways, you can relate to things in different ways, you can conceive of things in different ways, and ultimately you're able to participate with things in different ways. That is an option that's available to us as human beings. So the critical, or one of the critical insights for me was that out of each of these ways of seeing, a new world is created and discovered. So for instance, the resource acquisition lens, right? If I put that on and look at the world through that way of seeing, certain things happen. Certain understandings become available. Certain paths open up throughout history. In fact, to a large degree, we can look around and see, the world that we have created together is in large part a result of that way of seeing operating within many human minds at once. Right? So the way of seeing that sees the world and starts to think, what's relevant here is what I can extract, what I can turn into profit, what I can take and make into products and resources, what I can capitalize on, you might say. Or the way of seeing that we call science, that seeks to understand how it is that these things work, how they interlock with each other. So we can tell stories that allow us to explain the way things are such that we can create technology, right? That's a way of seeing. So one of the other pieces to this is that there's not any way to escape this situation, unfortunately. You can't say, oh, there are ways of seeing, I'm just going to stop seeing things a certain way. I invite you to try that, right? See if you can do that, and see what happens. You'll find that you kind of just go into another way of seeing. It seems like everywhere you look, there's a way of seeing to be found. Right? There's not like some place that's free from ways of seeing. In fact, that itself is a rather pernicious way of seeing. You'll find it in many different philosophical systems, the kind of view from nowhere, right? The idea that we're going to somehow look at things as if it's the one way to see things or beyond the ways of seeing, that too is a way of seeing that takes itself not to be a way of seeing. Very confusing, and that's part of how it, weasels into your mind and occupies your attention.
How about deep sleep?
Deep sleep. Can you say what?
Nothing's happening.
Right, yeah, so if there's no perception, there might not be a way of seeing active. Yeah. But if there is perception, there's a way of seeing.
Right, but we all take relief. You said it could be a bad thing. Can't escape this. But we all do it, right?
Yes.
I don't want it. And that can happen. Some people say the perfect meditation is deep sleep except you're awake.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and that is exactly right. That's part of what we're attempting to do in meditation, actually, is create less and less, you might say, complex ways of seeing, discover less and less fabricated ways of being in the world.
And to resolve the will from having to choose.
That's perhaps one way of looking at it, yeah. Yes. Yeah. So is this making sense so far? Anybody? More questions? Okay. And so most of the ways of seeing that we operate with are installed in us by culture, family, upbringing, so on and so forth. There are lots of ways of seeing what a human being is, but you might try on a way of looking at human beings that sees them as collections of ways of seeing. Seeing yourself as a collection of ways of seeing. Habitual ways that you see and participate with reality, right? Subject, object. What am I going to do with my life? Think about how many ways of seeing are kind of implicit in that statement, right? My life, what am I going to do? As if, so you start to see that this is an interesting way of framing lots of different situations and kind of questions that we might have about how things are. So the reason why this is all a big deal for me is that we end up constructing our experience through the ways of seeing that we use. Right? So like I said, if you have a way of seeing that sees resources or sees people as being means to ends, you end up creating a world in which that is the world. You create an experience in which that is the experience because you're using that way of seeing to organize the world, right? Again, we have that freedom, and so this is an invitation to recognize and reckon with that freedom. So different ways of seeing create, discover different worlds, different others, different senses of self. So when I look at the world in a science way, I create and discover a scientific world. Right? Oh, the world is so scientific, so logical, so ordered, so rational. Huh, amazing, wonderful. When I look at the world as sacred and divine, I create and discover a sacred and divine world. Beautiful. We have that freedom. We can do either one. We have this capacity. And so, of course, there are many different criteria we might use to select what ways of seeing we want to leverage at any moment. As I said, science has its own criteria of like soundness and symmetry, validity, evidence, so on and so forth. And that's kind of like trying to do a particular thing, right? And that's beautiful and good and appropriate. In the context of most forms of like Buddhist contemplative practice, we would say we select ways of seeing that reduce our suffering. So we take on ways of seeing that reduce our suffering. We might also try out ways of seeing that we can play with, like metta, which increase the sense of kindness or compassion or loveliness. That's another kind of little bucket. But in general, the kind of jewel at the heart of the Dharma is the collection of ways of seeing that erode, uproot, dampen, and ultimately end suffering. And that happens by invoking them, by practicing them, by learning to see from this prescription, these number of ways of seeing that erode suffering, that lead to the end of suffering. And they do that. Well, I guess everything is making sense so far. This is clear. Okay. So the usual example that I give is the three characteristics. Right. So anybody not familiar with the three characteristics of Buddhism? Does everybody know what they are? No idea. Cool. No. Good. So you'll probably know them when I say them. The three characteristics, sometimes called the three marks of existence, are impermanence, suffering, and no self. Okay? The three marks, three characteristics. Often these are presented in a lot of different learning communities as kind of like truths to be recognized or embodied. Like, you should understand that everything is impermanent, that all is suffering, and that you don't have a self. Okay, right? So that creates interesting philosophical discussions, perhaps, but that's not how I would argue we ought to relate to these three characteristics. Instead, I would interpret it, that the Buddha was suggesting three ways of seeing that we can actually use when we sit in meditation, right? So what is it like to take on the way of seeing that sees what's most relevant in my experience is that it is impermanent? Right? What does it mean to tune into that? What does it mean to really look at that? What does it mean to put that at the top of my relevance landscape in my cognition, in my mind, in my perception, in my phenomenology? What happens when I do that? Similarly, what happens when I really look at what creates suffering? I notice, as the Buddha said, that any time there's resistance, clinging, it amplifies suffering. What happens if I just allow my experience to be as it is instead? I just take that as the way of seeing, allowing. Or what if I notice that I can also take on this way of seeing that kind of notices that everything is just sort of happening. It's kind of just happening. There's not any agent doing a thing, really. At least I can look at my experience that way, where things are just sort of arising and passing away, and I'm not doing anything, it's just happening. What happens when we invoke those ways of seeing is that clinging gets weaker or lessened, gets dampened. We let go. And when we let go, there's less suffering. One of my favorite Ajahn Chah quotes is, if you let go a little bit, you'll know a little bit of peace. If you let go a little more, you'll know a little more peace. If you let go a lot, you'll know a lot of peace. And if you let go completely, you'll know the peace of the Buddhist. Okay? So that's really what we're attempting to do when we meditate, is take on ways of seeing that have the result of causing us to let go. Because why would we let go of things, or why would we hold on to things that are impermanent, they're just passing away? Yes?
I don't want to sidetrack you, so you can just squash this question if you want, but I'm wondering about how the word suffering even invokes a way of seeing compared to some of the other translations of dukkha, such as fundamental dissatisfaction. I'm wondering if you might want to say anything about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure what you have in mind.
If I take the word suffering, say for instance, if I'm doing looking at 3 characteristics.
Yeah.
If I ask, is this suffering? It's sometimes it doesn't really match. But if I ask, does this satisfy? It's much more resonant.
Yeah.
So when I think suffering, or when I think most people hear the word suffering, it doesn't seem to capture. Doesn't seem like everything is drenched in suffering. That seems really dark and gothic.
Right.
And so it seems like that's a way of seeing in itself that a lot of people tend to bring to it, which kind of doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Well, and so I think the key in what you said is it doesn't work for you, right? And so one of the things that I most appreciate about having this frame, is that it enables that kind of sensitivity. I'm not doing this because somebody gave me this rite and ritual. I'm just gonna follow my breath 1,000,000 times until something happens and I'm happy, right? I understand what it is that I'm kind of attempting to accomplish here. And for me, this understanding of suffering doesn't really work. It doesn't kind of land in my experience, right? It doesn't allow me to release clinging and release suffering and be happier. And so maybe it's more, this fundamental dissatisfaction, or maybe it's more I'm really curious about where this is all going. I want to know what it means to unfabricate my experience. I want to know what emptiness is. It's not about suffering. It's about the joy of exploring what consciousness is capable of. Maybe that's more your thing, right? But it allows us to kind of get out of the constrictions of dogma and the supposed to, and enter into a more creative, playful, I would say sovereign position in relationship to our practice. That's a good question. Is suffering something that lands for you, or is it more something else? Find out what motivates you. Right? And so I will. Okay. We'll do a little bit of practice with that and see what happens. Anybody have any questions before we jump in? So I'll just kind of lay out what I'm intending to do here. So I'm going to do a guided meditation first. We're going to do a little bit of samadhi practice, concentration, cultivate a little bit of well-being. And then we'll use that as a basis to explore the 3 ways of seeing that I mentioned: impermanence, suffering, and no self. Don't feel like you have to follow along. If you want to just stick with samadhi and just keep cultivating a sense of well-being and calm and peace, do that. If you get to the impermanence characteristic and it's really jamming for you and you like it and it's good, just stick with that, don't move on. But also feel free to try out all 3 and see how it goes. Yeah.
Again, if you don't want to get into this, just sort of go to practice. I can squash the question, but I feel like there's a link there uncompleted of like, so how does meditation, in your view, change the ways of seeing, or what does meditation do in the framework you laid out there?
What does meditation do in the... Yeah, okay. I guess I should have been more explicit. Thank you. Yeah, so in this frame, we might see that meditation accomplishes a couple of things. One is that it's a way to release ourselves from the ways of seeing that have been installed in us by our culture and by our family and by our world. Right? And this is extremely essential in today's world because the ways of seeing that are currently operating on our planet is hurtling us towards extinction, or the possibility of extinction. So we need to sort of uninstall the current operating system. And meditation can do that by leveraging ways of seeing that reveal the emptiness of all ways of seeing, including the ones that have been installed in us by our culture. The other thing that it allows us to do is to play with new ways of seeing, right? Once we kind of get into this ability to deconstruct our perception and our ways of seeing that have been installed in us, we can then playfully deploy new ones, right? So we can see that, maybe what's it like to live in a world in which, like, everybody is my friend, right? A traditional way of seeing that the Buddhists recommend. All are my friends, may all be happy. It's a way of seeing, and if you live from that, it creates a different world. And maybe that world, maybe that way of participating in the world is more appropriate, more useful now, or leads to more happiness, or more well-being, more joy, whatever. And so it gives you that sort of like platform for experimentation as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Cool. Awesome. Okay, so let's try it out. To begin, invite you to straighten up and find a posture that feels alive, aligned, and if possible, has a sense of nobility to it. Might be possible to find the kind of energetic tone of alertness, aliveness, as you kind of get into that posture. invite you to open up to your experience. Say hello. Whatever you're hearing, seeing, feeling, the quality of your mind, mental talk, your somatic experience, through checking in. So the idea of this first practice, samadhi practice, is to cultivate a sense of energized calm. And one way to do this is with the breath. And there are many ways to breathe that help to cultivate this sense of peace, well-being, ease, pleasure. So I'll suggest a few. If you find one that works, keep doing that. In general, just welcome and pay attention to any feeling of ease, calm, tranquility that may arise. Breath you can try is breathing long. Extending the exhale, extending the inhale. Not needing to force anything. Extending the breath. Also try tuning into the restful qualities of breathing. Whether subtle or profound, the breath tends to carry with it some sensations of restfulness, particularly the out-breath. Just tune in to that feeling of rest. with this method, it can be helpful too to notice anywhere you're holding tension in your body and breathe that out. Allowing it to relax. Creating and discovering restfulness in your experience. You might also experiment with breathing in energy, the whole body. Breathing out relaxation in the whole body. Each breath. Breathing in, energizing. Breathing out, relaxing. So the invitation here again is to breathe or participate with your experience in whatever way cultivates a sense of calm, well-being, peace, ease. It doesn't have to be profound, but heading in that direction, a little more calm, a little more easeful. This calm, this ease invites a unification of the mind and the body. Creates a vehicle for insight. And it just can feel good. And that's wonderful. It's okay to just feel good. In fact, feeling good for no reason is a radical act. Just that. You might experiment with imagining that the breath is coming and going from the center of your head. Breathing in, expanding. Breathing out, shrinking. Or you might imagine yourself to be breathing from your heart center. What does it feel like to breathe with your heart? You might try breathing in through your lower belly, your dantian. Again, if any of these suggestions, for whatever reason, is interesting in particular, go ahead and explore. As you continue your practice, can be interesting and useful to experiment with seeing the breath in various ways. What is it like to see the breath as chi energy, life force? How does that affect your experience? To use that way of seeing. see it as energy, prana. Spirit. That way of seeing doesn't feel available. No worries. Let it go for now. Or what is it like to see the breath as kind of love energy, somehow imbued with love? What is that way of seeing like? This way of seeing the breath is available to you, it can be nice to breathe in a sense of receiving love from the world. Breathe out, giving love to the world. Try that and see what happens. So in a moment I'll ring the bell. We'll have a short bio break. And then when we return, we'll explore the 3 characteristics. And in order for that exploration to be very fruitful. We recommend that you try and keep the momentum of your practice. Try to return to your seat with this state of calm, whatever you've established, as best you can. And we'll do a little bit of work to reestablish it when we return. alertness, aliveness, perhaps nobility. And seeing if there's any sense of well-being, calm, ease, peace, and opening to that, welcoming that. So we'll do a little tour, experiment of the 3 characteristics. Each of these will be treating as a way of seeing. Each of them inviting us to look at our experience in a particular way. A way that, according to the Buddha and to many practitioners, leads us out of suffering, disease, clinging, towards liberation, freedom, peace. The first characteristic is impermanence. This way of seeing asks us to make relevant, to pay attention to the changing nature of our perception. Tuning in to change. Caring less about what is changing and more about that it is changing. You may notice it as kind of undulation, flickering, is tune in to that. Can be helpful to use a label here. Might try changing, change, change. As you tune in to this ongoing changingness, impermanence, you may notice some quality of ease arises too. You don't need to try to let go. Seeing impermanence causes you to let go. Why would you hold on? Change. Change. This way of seeing, you can zoom in to a particular part of your experience and observe that change, that impermanence. Your right leg, your hands, often it is easy to see impermanence in the hands. Hearing the rising and passing of sound. Or you can open to your whole sensory experience, allowing it to flux, shift, move, express its impermanence. Zooming in, zooming out, both are useful. If you find yourself getting tight or annoyed or constricted, try going back to the breath practice. Finding the balance between the sense of energized calm and this investigation, this deconstruction at the heart of this form of contemplative practice. Changing. Changing. You can stay with impermanence or the breath practice, or you can move on to exploring suffering, the characteristic of suffering, the way of seeing of suffering. This way of seeing invites us to notice suffering in our experience. Notice contraction, resistance, dis-ease, discomfort. And to allow it, open to it, welcome it completely. Find a particular part of your experience, your body perhaps, feels tight, constricted, contracted. Place your attention there Shinzen so elegantly puts it. Suffering equals pain multiplied by resistance. Find the pain in your experience and allow it completely. Welcome it completely. If you feel like it's not working for you, see if you can allow that not working for you. Opening to the experience, allowing the experience. Another facet of this way of seeing is seeing the connection between resisting our perception and muscle, body tension. Another way in is to notice that whatever suffering there's somewhere tension in the body. Allow that. Breathe into that. Release that. Another way of living. And notice if adopting this way of seeing decreases suffering, creates more space, more ease, more lightness of being. Might not be a lot. Might be a lot. In any case, this is why we practice. Ways of seeing take time to develop, to grow. Allowing this experience. Whatever it is. Welcoming. of seeing that we'll explore is anatta, selflessness, not self. Instead of a philosophical idea here practiced as a way of seeing. Tuning into the way that experience is just happening. It's not mine. Not me. Just happening. Like a shooting star. The wind through the trees. Just happening. With this way of seeing, certain aspects of your experience may be more accessible. Suggest exploring various facets. Sounds just happening. And hearing just happening. nature of unfolding. The whole experience. Just nature unfolding. Just happening. The last couple of minutes, we'd invite you to explore whichever method felt the most interesting to you. One seemed most accessible, or interesting, resonant, or that you felt the most curious about. Each of these ways of seeing is a path. Each affords particular insights. And we might be drawn to one or two or maybe all three. It's fine. So, have some time for discussion. Take a little more time than usual, which I'm happy about. So, how was that for folks? If you want to report anything you discovered, or how it was for you, or any questions about anything at all. This is, I think a couple things I wish that I had said at the beginning of the talk. One thing is just, this is what I love. You know, partly this is a way that I've discovered to think about this path such that I can really fall in love with it. Right? That's part of for me, the affordance of this framework, is that it affords me to really fully love this path. And then the second part is that much of this, almost all of it is inspired by a particular teacher named Rod Burbea, who teaches out of Gaia House in the UK. So this is not like me kind of just like being a genius. So just so you know, I'm happy to like direct you to resources by him if you're curious. But yeah, so this is time for questions, sharings, whatever you like. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting in that last practice to notice the dependent arising with like a sense experience, and so like hearing only was arising when there's sound. Sensing in the body, feeling something in the body was only arising when it was a feeling, and having them kind of be distinguished was quite revitalizing. It kind of inspired a little reflection about the relationship between suffering and having the eyes being open. When the eyes are open, a lot of the time it's like very hard to see that distinction between what is seen and seeing, and that they're arising together. And it's really fascinating how just like that you have an object, the activity of seeing and self just kind of pop into existence and then disappear again.
Yeah.
So just a comment.
Yeah, beautiful. And just so everybody knows, John is a bit of like, what do they call it? A plant in the audience, in that he is also deeply steeped in this particular framework. So,
Totally steady.
That's a well played, thank you.
I think it's called the ringer.
Oh, the ringer, yeah. Okay.
Curious if there's a tension that often comes up for me with particularly the suffering and stuff, of like on the one level, like in some sense, at least the way you describe it, you're like letting it fully, like welcoming it fully. Then in some other sense, you're like simultaneously holding an intention of like wanting it like not to be there. Like that's why you're meditating, in some sense. So I don't know. That's what like what you've described it as like the reason we adopt these ways of seeing is because they reduce suffering or something. I'm just curious your thoughts on that tension.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think though that we can make this kind of tension a lot easier by really just getting into our phenomenology, right? Just getting into our actual experience, moment by moment. And in that, we can notice, like, am I actually resisting my experience? Like, am I wanting it to change in this moment? And what does that do to my experience? Right? So we can have this kind of like philosophical position like, but you are meditating and therefore you don't want things to be the way they are, because if you did, then why would you meditate, right? And like, we can kind of get wrapped up into that. It seems paradoxical, and yet we can find ourselves sitting and see if that is actually present then in that moment. And if it is, we will find that if we can release that desire for things to be other than they are, we will have less suffering in that moment, right then and there.
The answer to this might be potentially related to what you just said. But I found I was in a very pleasant state by the end of the first guided meditation period. And then in the second one, because I'd been primed for what was coming next, and I had a sense of like, no, this isn't the way I like to do it, or like, you know, and I was like hoping to get back into that state, but by the time I got back on the chair, it was like, I would need 10, 15, 20 minutes to get back here. And so it was like this tension. And then I'm wondering if there's a way of seeing to release these real subtle expectations of things going a certain way, which seems to be a huge obstacle for me. Which is also good because it's workable. It's like an obstacle that I learned from having to continuously overcome. But I'm wondering if there's a way of seeing you might offer to kind of like let go of this subtle grasping for like success.
Oh, I do actually.
Yeah.
So I this is what I've been playing with recently, and I love it. Okay, so this is not, as far as I know, a prescribed way of seeing by the Buddha, but nonetheless, I find it very effective. So the way this one works, and you can do it right now. You quote meditate, and you ask yourself, what is here if there is no problem? No, and then you can do that again. Just ask that question again. You can shorten it, no problem. And so, one of the functions of the mind is to create and discover problems. And so this kind of short circuits that tendency. And this is very good with expectations and things like that. I find it very helpful.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry for being late. I didn't catch your name.
Oh, I'm Daniel.
Danny?
Daniel.
Daniel. Jeffrey. I have the paradox of, I think I'm hearing it here in other people's, what they're saying, that on the one hand we have the luxury of many techniques and ways of seeing, and we have a profound appreciation as meditators that if you change your mind, you change the world, as far as you see it. And that's so powerful in and of itself that we go zooming around a little or slowing down a little into various explorations of our freedom to choose perspective, ways of looking. And that creates what, to me, is a New Age marketplace. I used to be in a unity, and we had a funny day one day when a fella came in, he looked just like Jerry Garcia, and he was on tour all around to various New Age churches, and we weren't sure what was going on, but he set up this semi-golden red tapestry in front of everybody, and then he was welcomed by the community and started his he said he wanted to teach us something that he learned about meditation. But he started with the story of how all this started, which was a bunch of friends said, oh, we're going to see Dolly Parton at the Astrodome, the Houston Astrodome, huge place. And he said, oh, great, great, great. And he was going and he got there and realized, I heard it wrong. They said Dolly, I said Dolly Parton, it's Dalai Lama. So it won't be Dolly Parton, it will be Dalai Lama. And the place was packed and he was surrounded by all these devotees and he was like, wow, I guess I'm surprised. And then somebody came through the crowd and came to him, a monk, and handed him this package. Little package wrapped in paper, and he took it, said, this is from the Dalai Lama to you. I didn't plan to come here, what's going on? Is this free packages for people? And he said he took it home and there was a note in it from the Dalai Lama telling him this tapestry, which was now hanging in front of us, is part of a worldwide meditation, and it's a practice that's been sent out amongst the people, that if you teach people how to meditate in a simple way, that instead of considering that your mind is somewhere in your body, in the world, and you can choose perspectives with your mind, that all of this bodies and things, anything measurable, is inside the mind. The mind is not something inside a body. And so he guided us into that simple shift of perspective. And he didn't tell us where the mind was or anything. He just said everything is inside your mind. So, duh, psychics, okay, I can agree with that, maybe. So everybody got into it, and he said, the tapestry, I was told that when I'm finished with my worldwide mission, the tapestry which was originally red will be completely golden. And it was before us in a mixed, it was a little red and a little gold. So we meditated, and he asked us to see if we could see the gold in the tapestry. And I said, wow, what a placebo effect. This is incredible. And he looks like Jerry Garcia. Anyway, that was one of the high points in my journey through the metaphysical New Age. And what I said at the beginning, that there came to me a desire to not have endless choices, like how many channels do I need before I have too many?
That's right.
And I love anyone who can consolidate all these techniques into an overarching and get it going, or put feet on it and give it livity.
Yes.
But, and I see that definitely happening here, that's why I come. But the need to resolve the experimental mind about endless perspectives in the subtle body was too much for me, and I had heard too many kind of no-self things like, there is no place, my favorite koan when I was growing, there is no place to seek the mind, it is like the footprints of the birds in the sky. So I love that there is a consolidation and an integration and a singularity point, and that's part of samadhi, or dharana at least. Something is going on here that resolves the endless decision maker. What technique is appropriate for this individual, or for me at this time, in this place, etc. And I've heard many here in this community talk about how I was fumbling through my techniques and trying to get to one. It becomes humorous, and that's great. So the resolution of intentionality, so that it can be creative, bouncy, playful, and at the same time experience samadhi, active oneness with full diversity of free will of beings who could be no selves, but they're instead playing. Not just no suffering, they're creative. That's what I kind of wanted to, somehow I had to, anyway, I still haven't found it, so. That community that can actually articulate something beyond the mind-body attempt to coordinate itself. I appreciate any honest attempt, but I'm still looking for the community that can embody. I've seen individuals actually, and they start communities, and shit happens. Excuse my French. But that's the end of my confession. There is no end, or there is, hopefully, I don't know. But the final offering is a poem which I try to resolve things into art that are polemical. If I may make an offering, is that okay? Ears are open. It's called Contemplation's Couch. On contemplation's couch, I once supposed that all thoughts that stand opposed have given their existence to each other, as doubt knows certainty as its mother. So I sat midway between the two. To take no sides, I resolved to do. Then, as dawn's light unfolds the colors of the day, or life's breath expands through our cold clay, infinity found infinity in each creation's verse, and echoed through my ears, as our God might converse. Through nature's veils, he seemed to speak, glimpse the truth of just one peak. Then singing said to me, when infinity you see alone, it is the illusion to which you are prone. For inconceivable are my ways, beyond the logic that lights your days. Lo, your thoughts are limitations, links in a chain that forms your mind's perception of pleasure and pain. But come, behold what lies beyond the realm of logic's spiral bond, where convoluting contradictions converge in me and flood over the face of life that logic does see, to wash away its shadows and gloom and dress it in divinity's aplume. Please respond, if you like, or anybody.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that does come to mind, there's a lot that I don't know how to respond to in what you shared. But what does come up for me is something that you said about the kind of postmodern spiritual marketplace. And for me, that's very much at the heart of what I appreciate about this framework, is that it helps us see that all of the various teachers and kind of products in the marketplace are invitations to ways of seeing. Right? They're just inviting you to see things differently and to practice that kind of perceptual training. But really they're all equalized. Right? And it helps us sort of cut through the bullshit, excuse my French, and sort of see what they're actually offering without being diluted by marketing, essentially, which is very important in today's ecosystem. So, yeah, I appreciate you sensing that that's part of what's involved here.
Yeah, deeply, yes. I can see that you can't have leadership without, and mindfulness together, without understanding this to some degree or another.
Is it whatever, when you look at the different products in the marketplace and choose them select them as ways of seeing, isn't a way of seeing needed before you even embark on that? And that way of seeing is itself a product in the marketplace. And
Yeah, and to a certain degree, it's like you try something out, you see how it goes for you, right? And so the thing that is also important to say in kind of presence is, and this is what I was attempting to invite us to look at with the practice, right? It's like when you do this practice, ease comes, and you can trust that directionality, right? You can just keep moving in that direction of less, of more simplicity, of releasing complexity. And according to the Buddhist contemplative path, and I'm not saying that this is the only way to see what we're doing, or the best way, but it is, I think, what is being said here, is that the directionality is towards less. is towards no thingness, right? And so you can try different ways of seeing, but the proof is in the pudding, right? Are they a doorway to less? Less suffering, less, in fact, perception, less complexity. And so that becomes then the kind of way of seeing that helps you make sense out of the other ways of seeing, right? Do they actually work to afford that reduction in suffering?
And I found what you said earlier about contraction when we're meditating, guiding us on suffering, that if we're open towards what's closed, it tends to open.
That's right.
And why that is a wonderful thing. I mean, I wouldn't want to question it.
Yeah.
But it seems to be, it's scientific phenomenology of consciousness. That it's not an infinite regress of I'm coming from some sort of mindset and I can't get out of the conditioned mind. It's that the open mind is already out. And anything it looks at tends to give up its idealism of I am the best idea. You know? There is no best except pure conscious openness, love, devotion that is not conditional. That's metta. It's what we can talk about it or you can experience. And one pales in relation to the other. It's not an idea, right? It's an experiential proof. Meditation by the Buddha, you're your lamp unto yourself. And if you can't get confidence in the practice, some sky pirate's going to get you. If you can't, in yourself, know what is true by your own honesty, how will anybody tell you anything true?
So I came here having been trained in a few spiritual practices. Native American spirituality, science of mind, a cousin of unity. You do Native American spirituality at the monastery in a variety of ways, and Shinzen grew up in the Church of Religious Science. And I put a lot of effort into those, as much effort as you've seen me put in here, because I needed to find a spiritual path that worked for me, primarily to reduce suffering. I consider it, I meditate because it's healing. And so I come here, and you're right, everything is just brought down. It's much more elemental. Native American spirituality is practically infinite in the things that you can do there, and science of mind is also very infinite. And I found when I came here in December of 2012, it happened to me right away, I had gotten so far out into this huge universal mind that I was completely lost. And I came here and I sat here one time, and Soryu just packed me right back into my body, and I was like, oh my God, I'm here. And so that's what I appreciate about the practice, and I was thinking, and Jeffrey said it, and I believe you said it in your talk too, I was thinking about, it's not really faith. It's like I don't have faith in the practice, but I trust the practice because I've experienced that it works. And so even on a night like tonight, where I never say to myself I have a good practice or a bad practice. Tonight I was not here. I didn't do a very good job for myself. I'm very distracted by something else. And I think Jeffrey said it in his poem, Because when I walk out that door tonight and look up into the sky, or whatever's going on out there in nature, I'm gonna be fine, because I trust that. And then we'll gradually be able to bring myself back to the practice. I'll probably rethink this a bunch more tonight, you know. And so that's what I appreciate again about the practice, and the how we describe suffering, or this fairly complicated concept of impermanence or attachment, more complicated. They're still very precise and very doable, and I have a lot of trust in the practice. And so I too appreciate sitting in this room. I'm sorry I don't have a deep question, but I just really enjoy the order of things. There's 3, there's 4, there's 8. It's not that complicated.
And what comes up, thank you for sharing that. What comes up for me was one of the things I really like about this approach too is that it enables a level of like creativity and autonomy with our practice. And so the first year that we offered a vision quest at the monastery, I did the vision quest, and that's basically you just like sit in a cordon off piece of the woods and just sort of like hang out for 3 days. Right? You don't really, there's nothing to do. They don't give you a practice or anything like that, like we do in this container here. They just sort of like throw you into the woods. You know, like, good luck. You know, see you in 3 days. And being there and looking out into the woods, into nature, there was a particular way of seeing that started to emerge. Right? That I was this way of being with the natural world that I had never experienced before in my life. It was beautiful, it was wondrous, it was really relaxing. And what I can now do is recall that way of seeing and sort of turn it around onto my experience and adopt it then as a way of seeing, right? That I can just like call up. And just as when you like when you look at the sky, right, you can kind of do that same thing. And we can understand that as a way of seeing, kind of use that to a doorway into practice, as you say. And yeah, I love that it's right there for